Grid option will help you when making images and shapes. What the grid will do is place a graph-like pattern on the workspace area. The grid is a nice feature to work with when either creating or manipulating objects or shapes. To understand how the grid works, let's first turn it on. We can do this by clicking on the View pull-down menu and then selecting Show Grid. And now we can see the grid. We can then use the lines to guide us when creating shapes and lines, or as a reference for placing images. But there's more about the grid that is helpful. For instance, Silhouette Studio allows us to have each point snap to the grid points. In other words, where each line intersects another. To enable snapping along with adjusting other grid settings, we can open the Grid Options sidebar by clicking on the View pull-down menu and selecting the Show Grid Options. Or as we discussed earlier, we can click on the Show Grid Options button on the right side of the window here. In the sidebar, we have settings specifically for the grid. We can set the spacing by increasing or decreasing it. We can set the divisions. Currently it is set to 5, which will place darker grid lines at every 5th line. Of course, each of these settings can be set by a value, or by moving the slider. Below that are the checkmark boxes, giving us the choice of showing the grid, which is currently checked, and to enable Snap to Grid. Let's enable the snapping by clicking on the checkmark box, and briefly demonstrate this by clicking on the rectangle button and drawing a square. Notice that as the first and second points are clicked, they are automatically snapped to 2 grid points. Once the rectangle is created, if we move it to a different location, it snaps to each grid point. As you can imagine, this can be very useful for creating different shapes, lines, or arcs. In the side panel, notice that there's a square type of grid and an isometric grid. Isometric puts the grid in a kind of 3D format. If we switch it to that pattern, double-click on a rectangle, you'll notice that now we can move the corners of the rectangle and place them in a 3-dimensional plane. Let's switch back to the square pattern. Right below the patterns, we can switch the color of the grid. The big square shows the current color of the grid. Clicking any one of the other smaller squares will change the color of the grid to that color.